Thank you all very much for joining us today. This is the launch webinar, the second of two sessions for the first public consultation period of the ASI standards revision. We've got a 45-minute session today and quite a lot to get through. My name is Chelsea Reinhardt. I'm the Director of Standards for ASI, and I'm joined on today's webinar by Chris Bayliss, Director of Climate and Decarbonization, and Leah Vacheray, Standards Manager. Today's session is really about talking you through a little bit of the background on the standards revision and explaining some of the changes in structure and format that you'll see in both the performance standard and the chain of custody standard. We won't have a chance on today's call to go in a deep dive into the content changes in the revision, but we will be talking through some of those key focus areas and questions for consultation, where we're really most keen to get stakeholder feedback during this consultation period. And we'll be signposting you to other resources and how to get involved in the consultation and give your feedback. We do have a couple of thematic content sessions coming up later in March on specific webinars, and we'll be running you through those at the end of the session as well. Before we begin, a couple housekeeping points. So first, a reminder of ASI's antitrust policy, which is available on our website. Any discussion of pricing, price premiums, passing prices on to customers is not supported under that policy, so please do be mindful today. And second, we want to acknowledge Indigenous peoples and their connections to the traditional lands where we and our members operate. It's our aim to respect the cultural heritage, the customs, and the beliefs of all Indigenous people, and to pay our respects to elders past and present. And just a note on using the Zoom platform, which is what we're on for today's webinar. We are taking questions through the Q&A function, which you'll see on the bottom or perhaps the top of your menu under that Q&A symbol. If you can pop your questions in there, please do get them in early. The last session that we did, we had few questions during the session and then a big rush at the end. We will try to get through as many as possible, so please do get those in during the session. Before we go into background on the revision project, I just want to make sure that everyone is clear on what the consultation is focusing on. So this first public consultation period is really inviting stakeholder comments, suggestions, and feedback on two main documents. The first is the revised ASI Performance Standard, and that's version 4 of the Performance Standard. And that's one main PDF document. It looks like this. It's available on the consultation page of the website, but it also has 3 separate modular sections which have been pulled out of the main draft. They do apply as part of the performance standard, but they apply only to certain entities or in specific contexts. And those include mine closure, bauxite residue and tailings management, and displacement and resettlement. So that's a new element of the structure, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. And secondly, we are consulting on the revised ASI chain of custody standard. For the COC, that's version 3. So if you see those version numbers floating around, version 4 of the performance standard and version 3 of the COC. All documents can be downloaded in multiple languages along with the supporting tools on our consultation webpage, and the link is there at the bottom. So the standards revision project is a multi-year effort. Officially, this project began back in 2024 with a review of the current ASI standards and feedback being collected from certified entities, ASI members, auditors, and others about how those standards were working in practice, how regulation and best practices were changing, and where there was room actually to evolve or to further improve the standards. The revision project formally launched in March of 2025 with approval from the ASI board and the standards committee, and we have spent the majority of that last year, together with input from many of you on the call today, reshaping, opening up, analyzing, and redrafting those standards as part of the revision process. We've had a lot of input during that period, and we're now, I think, at a really good place to put them out to a first of 2 public consultation periods. Each of those will be 60 days minimum. We are anticipating, if things stay on track, that second public consultation period would be either very end of 2026 or more likely the first few months of 2027, and that the performance standard and chain of custody standard would be finalized and approved sometime in the second half of 2027. At that point, there begins a gradual transition period where certified entities move over at their own pace and depending on their certification cycles to the new versions of the standards. So when you are looking at the consultation drafts and providing feedback, bear in mind that these standards should still be active and implemented well into the 2030s. So you're really thinking about a kind of lifetime of 7 to 8 years, perhaps a bit more from now, and trying to future-proof what we think are going to be good practice or leading practice expectations well into the future is really essential for this drafting process. Objectives of the revision. Why make changes in the standards? So these are a set of objectives that were discussed and agreed by the Standards Committee for ASI, and they really have been sort of the guiding light or the North Star to set the course for the revision. And they're also important to bear in mind. They provide some context for why different things have changed in the standards and why you'll see some new elements in format and structure. One of the first objectives that was set was to allow for the first time ever in the performance standard the concept of differentiation or more than one level to meet certification. And that was done both to recognize entities that are really performing above and beyond even good expectations in certain areas, but also to create clearer pathways for continuous improvement, no matter where a company is on their sustainability journey. The second objective was to further strengthen credibility, and that's both within the standard, but also in the associated assurance framework and guidance for auditors and implementation on the audit side, to make sure that the standard is strong not only on paper, but also consistently implemented in a credible way. The third objective was to improve the relevance of criteria, so focusing effort on the most critical areas. And this is a challenge because, as you can imagine, the numbers of topics covered in the performance standard is significant, and it creates, for every new ESG topic, there's an additional burden of implementation and auditability that happens with those areas. So on the right-hand side, you can see a version of what was an early materiality map that we drafted with input from the Standards Committee, technical experts, and working groups. And this was really one of the guiding principles, was to think about, can we focus elements in the standard on areas that really matter most and drive most significant impacts? And can we lighten the touch elsewhere for areas that are, of course, important, but perhaps not quite as impactful? The fourth was to strengthen focus on priorities of Indigenous people, and that's represented into the process largely by the participation of our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum. We'll talk about that a bit more on the next slide. And they've had a significant input into determination of priorities and where some of those content areas have shifted in response to the needs and the priorities of affected communities. The next is to enhance value to ASI members through certification, really making sure that the effort and the cost that goes into certification is producing value. And that comes in the intersection as well between the performance standard, the chain of custody standard, and the demand for ASI material or COC material that's flowing through the supply chain. The next one was to improve alignment with other standards, and you will see that throughout the revisions, we have not only maintained the alignment and the benchmarking and equivalence recognition, but we've also tried to expand and to strengthen that with a number of other standards and frameworks. And last, I would say also very tied to number 3 on relevance, is to really renew the focus on impact. So as you're going through the drafts, help us make sure we have stayed true to these objectives, right? Do we have requirements or criterion that are just about creating paperwork or documentation and aren't really driving impact in a way that's meaningful? Please let us know. Those of you who participated in our webinars last year will have seen this slide. This is just a snapshot of the kind of multi-stakeholder working group process that has gotten us here to this point since the launch of the revision. We have had a lot of different eyes from a lot of different stakeholder groups, not only reviewing these drafts, but also really co-creating them using some collaborative drafting tools through the process. We've had significant impact from the IPAF Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum. We've had 6 thematic working groups with multi-stakeholder composition of each, who had a total of, I think, 37 meetings over that drafting period. We had 13 different technical experts sit down and do detailed reviews of specific content areas to make sure that their feedback was taken into account. So lots of different elements coming in, and that has given us a good sense of where some of those most controversial or polarized issues are coming into the consultation. However, it hasn't always helped us figure out which option or which course to take where those issues are controversial, and that's where your feedback will come in and be very important during this period. All right, so that's a sort of a whirlwind overview of the revision project and how we've got into this consultation period. Now I'm going to talk you through with Chris some of the key structural changes that you'll see when you go into those drafts. The first thing to note is that we have reorganized principles. So we've moved from the kind of core 3 principle ESG focus in version 3 of the performance standard into a structure that has now 3 cross-cutting principles: governance, management systems, and responsible sourcing and due diligence. Important to note here is that the management system includes cross-cutting risk assessments and cross-cutting management systems, both on health, safety, and environment, but also on human rights and due diligence for your own operations in that section too. And that was done to try and reduce duplication and improve efficiency across all those different topic areas. Everything related to responsible sourcing, due diligence, and environmental and social impacts in the supply chain are now sitting in that section 3. And then thematic areas and impacts related to sort of own operations or direct activities across climate, nature, circularity, community rights, and workers' rights are in these thematic sections 4 through 8. And then, as mentioned earlier, we have separated out of the main performance standard into a set of modular sections, content or requirements that are really important, but apply really only to a subset of our ASI certified entities and can be referenced as and when needed. And it might be that there are other areas that could also belong as modular sections, so please do give us your feedback on that as well. Second, for those of you who are very familiar with the current version 3 of the performance standard, you'll know that there's a lot of text contained underneath some of those criterion in the current draft. And each of these sort of sub-bullets in the version 3 structure is in fact normative required text that needs to be audited and implemented. In version 4, we have split out those sub-bullets under each criterion. So the conformance assessment, whether or not you have a minor non-conformance, a major non-conformance, or you're in conformance, remains at the criterion level. But each of those sub-bullets or those little sentences nested underneath the narrative in version 3 has now been separated out and made into a distinct requirement that would sit under the criterion. And the reason for doing that is, 1, to improve the consistency of implementation and auditing across the standard and to make sure that it remains credible. But second, to really force some visibility on each of these subpoints, especially in the drafting and development phase, to make sure that things are not overlooked and then actually become normative text, and we expect companies to be implementing and meeting them. So entities would be required to meet those applicable sub-requirements, but that would sort of roll up to an overall conformance decision at the criterion level. So that's a subtle but quite important change to take note of. Now I'll turn it over to Chris to go through the next structure change. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Chelsea. As Chelsea mentioned, that differentiation is a key objective in the standards revision process. And the question comes, how do we enable that differentiation that recognizes leading practice or those entities that go beyond a minimum requirement? And how do we articulate a pathway for continuous improvement for those who would like to move towards leading practice? And the approach that's been taken by the Standards Committee and in the working group's discussion is to have specific leading practice requirements articulated within the standard that entities can choose to be audited against. And I'll talk about how you might do that in a moment. First is to say, as you look at the documents, and this is focused specifically on the performance standard, you'll see in a number of areas these leading practice requirements there highlighted throughout, with this grey shading behind and with leading practice actually explicitly articulated in the text. They don't sit everywhere. These leading practices are within certain of the thematic sections, sections 4 to 8. I'll show you in a minute what that might look like, along with section 3, responsible sourcing, due diligence, and section 9, mine closure. These requirements behave like the minimum requirements, but they are not mandatory for entities going in and certifying against the performance standard. What they are is a way for entities to signal to the auditors and to ASI that they want to be assessed against leading practice, and thus to show evidence against those. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the places where you'll see this leading practice are in these thematic sections: climate, nature, circularity, community rights, and workers' rights, as well as responsible sourcing, due diligence, and mine closure for those entities that are implementing that modular section. And at the moment, the proposed approach is that entities which meet at least 70% of the applicable requirements under those specific sections can make a differentiated claim. They can set themselves apart from entities which have chosen not to be assessed against leading practice. Those entities that choose to do this can do it against one, let's say just a climate theme, or they can do it against multiple thematic areas. And how we see that being recognized at the moment is this ability to make this differentiated claim that might also form part of the certification. So you can see an example here of the kind of text one might see, that an entity is certified against the full standard, but with leading practice in climate and circularity themes. What we really need in this public consultation process is for you to tell us a number of things. One, have we set that leading practice at the right level, or do some of these leading practice requirements really belong in minimum? Are they a minimum that all entities should be performing against as long as those requirements are applicable? Or have we got it about right? Or have we gone too far? Are these leading practices just not available for anyone in the industry, or for a very small cohort? Are they too much of a stretch? Also, what we'd like to hear is your thoughts on the on how that's implemented in practice. So this ability to make a differentiated claim by theme. One thing to note is how we see this is that entities would choose to be assessed against leading practice. So at the point of getting ready for audit during self-assessment, the entity themselves would say, yeah, I want to be audited against this leading practice. And then they'd have to demonstrate to the auditor with objective evidence how they meet it. So the leading practice is triggered by the entity before audits occur. Otherwise, everything else, all minimum requirements, apply to everyone. So yeah, really need your feedback on the level that those leading practices are set, how they roll together to form a differentiated claim, and also importantly, have we missed any leading practices out? If there are gaps, let us know. Next slide, please. Another of the objectives that Chelsea talked about is this idea of materiality and applicability. You'll note that as this requirement focused articulation of the standard has occurred, you see there are more requirements than previously. There aren't really, it's just that they've been articulated more clearly with one row really per requirement. But not all requirements are applicable for all entities or all supply chain activities. for many of parts of the supply chain, some of these, the risks that the requirements are trying to address really aren't material. They don't apply because the impacts are very low. And so in this revision process, what we're trying to do is to focus on that materiality aspect, to really place requirements where there is going to be an impact or where there's a significant risk to be addressed. So as you're reading through the documents, I invite you to really focus on this applicability column. You can see it highlighted at the bottom here in blue, which shows very clearly which supply chain activities these requirements apply to. And by default, not all requirements apply to all entities. So really do delve in to see what might apply to your part of the value chain, and tell us actually if we've missed anything out. One quite useful way to do this, and I think Leah's going to talk about it later on, is to use one of the tools that we've developed, which is a mapping tool, which enables filtering by supply chain activity. So you can clearly and quickly see for certain supply chain activities which requirements apply. There's a second element as well, which is not just applicability by supply chain activity, but applicability depending on the risk involved. So there are requirements which are kind of, what would you say? They are dependent on other requirements. If the earlier requirement has shown that there is minimal risk, then the subsequent requirements do not apply. So this cascading effect of risk identification and then requirements accordingly. And that's articulated again in the documents and in the mapping tool, which is on the consultation hub, which we'll talk about a bit later on. Next slide, please. As part of this materiality approach, and in a lot of conversations pre-consultation, and in fact over the last 5 years, since the development of version 3 of the performance standard, what we see is that the high burden of full certification, which really was developed for the higher risk upstream elements of the aluminium value chain, they're not always applicable to all parts of the value chain. Also, there's a really important role for downstream entities for the sustainability of the industry to get involved in things like circularity, product design, end-of-life recycling, end-of-life recovery rates. And so what we're doing is we have made a proposal. You'll see it articulated in the documents, and we're seeking your feedback on that proposal for a streamlined certification option for downstream entities. And what that streamlined option involves is really it strips out elements of the standard which have low materiality, we think, and our working groups think, for those parts of the value chain, and really focuses on those areas where we think downstream entities play a crucial role. And those areas are specifically in responsible sourcing and due diligence, climate, and circularity. So this streamlined option, only available for certain parts of the value chain downstream, would be a way for entities really to demonstrate that they are affecting change, but with a much more narrow set of requirements. In fact, it strips it down from over 180 to around 50 minimum requirements. So a much less burdensome certification option focused on the issues that are most material for those parts of the value chain. We really welcome your feedback on that, about whether that is A, valuable, useful, B, whether it strips out too much, and C, whether it's going to enable increased uptake, I think, of the performance standard and chain of custody standard, which in turn drives upstream uptake of the performance standard. So this is somewhere to really focus on in your feedback. We'd really appreciate that. Next slide, please. One way you can look at what that streamlined option, how it works, is through this mapping tool I talked about earlier on. You can see some screen grabs on the left-hand side here from the the opening page, the opening worksheet of that Excel-based tool. What it does is it enables you to choose which supply chain activities you're interested in, and even to look at this streamlined option versus a full option. And what it does is when you make these choices, it then in subsequent sheets shows you the impact on the standard. So it shows you what requirements are mandatory, which are not required. So have a play around with that. You can also filter by supply chain activities in the worksheets as well. This mapping tool, Leah will talk about it a bit later on, has some other elements to it. But really what I'd like to say today is use this tool to see the kind of impact that choices of streamlined versus full certification or different entity choices can impact the minimum requirements. Not every requirement is applicable to all entities by default. One final thing on the right-hand side, you can see this just a bit of data driven, what the impacts of streamlined cert versus full certification means in terms of minimum requirements. And you can see the orange bars for streamlined, really that burden of certification is really stripped down for that streamlined option. Your feedback highly welcomed on that. With that, I think I'll pass back to you, Chelsea, for a bit of a deep dive on, or shallow dive, on what the changes are to the performance standard.
Thanks, Chris. So priority areas for consultation. There's sort of two main channels for feedback and input during the consultation process. The first is, of course, stakeholders like yourselves will provide comments on individual criterion or requirements. This is not worded right. This needs to align with this. We can't meet this requirement. The applicability is not correct. That's all very welcome. We also have identified, coming out of that significant pre-consultation and early stakeholder engagement process, a number of issues where the choices are complex, the options are imperfect, and we are specifically inviting feedback on how to navigate some of those structural and content-related areas. And you will see in the consultation survey that we have focused questions, both cross-cutting and then on specific topics. And I'll talk you through some of those now. For example, on the cross-cutting areas related to the performance standard, one of the areas we're looking for your input on is, should we include this kind of threshold or minimum percentage of applicable leading practice requirements in order to make a claim of leading practice in that section? Or do entities need to meet 100% of applicable leading practices in climate, for example? If we do have a threshold, is the 70% about right, or should it adjust up or down? We haven't talked today about small or medium enterprises, but we do have SMEs who are certified entities and members. They don't always have the loudest voices in our consultation processes, but it's really important to make sure that they're heard. We have an example or two in the standard where we have applicability that is different based on entity size or scale, but we don't have many of these right now, and we're looking for a steer from the stakeholder group as well, whether we should further adjust applicability for SMEs. As Chris mentioned, we're looking for consultation feedback on whether or not we move forward with this streamlined certification option, or indeed perhaps a different option to help maintain and even improve that engagement of the downstream sector to really drive change upstream through the aluminium value chain. And last, there is a lot of content in this standard. There's a lot of content in version 3. There's perhaps even a bit more in version 4. Which elements do you think actually could be lost from that revised version or moved to guidance without actually affecting the impact or the credibility of the standard? Help us identify those areas as well. And then just to give you a snapshot under some of the thematic areas, these are some of the most controversial or complex questions that have bubbled up for consultation. On climate, we have a really fundamental decision to make about whether or not we maintain or we remove, with this revision, the current smelter emissions threshold that's been historically embedded in version 3. And that's currently set at 11 tons per ton. And currently that's a minimum requirement for certification. In the revised draft, you'll see a couple of options on how we might approach that smelter emissions threshold going forward. with a set of pros and cons for either of those options. And we really welcome feedback from both sides of that argument to help guide us. Very important as well. In version 3, we have a minimum requirement for all entities to demonstrate progress in GHG emissions reductions along a 1.5 degree aligned pathway using the ASI method. We know that something around 90% of our certified entities are struggling to actually demonstrate conformance along that pathway, and we've introduced an exemption process for the short or midterm to help bridge that gap while still maintaining some pressure and expectation on emissions reduction. In this version 4 revised draft, you will see a couple of different options proposed on how to handle that structural challenge. Does performance along the 1.5 degree pathway move up to a leading practice expectation? And do we maintain some sort of differentiated, but still some sort of expectation for emissions reduction as a minimum requirement? And third, should we be broadening the evidence of 1.5 degree aligned targets perhaps beyond the ASI method, considering, for example, SBTI validated targets, especially for non-smelting entities, to really allow companies to set one integrated target setting strategy. On nature, one of the areas that we've had a lot of discussion with the working group is around how do we handle entities that don't have perhaps very material impacts on biodiversity, like a manufacturing facility in an industrial park, but still may want to do or still should be expected to do something around biodiversity impacts, either directly in their own operations or indeed in the value chain. So that's one of the areas that we'll be inviting your feedback on. In circularity, one of the questions that we're looking for input on is whether or not we should introduce cradle to grave LCAs as a leading practice requirement for downstream fabricating entities. And indeed, although we haven't talked a lot about circularity today, this section has been quite substantially revised from the version 3, and now it has been pulled out of the material stewardship subsection and given kind of prominence as its own critical thematic area. So also looking for your input on that. And under community impacts and community rights, this is an area where the materiality lens is very strong, and most requirements in this section apply only upstream where impacts on affected communities are perhaps most significant. Have we got that right? Does that need to be adjusted? Should we be introducing new requirements around community agreements, which are legally binding and go beyond just having a community benefits plan? And also under that section, we've had a lot of debate about the expectation to address legacy impacts and how can we do that in a way that balances the needs and priorities of those affected communities while recognizing the very valid concerns from industry members about the complexity of doing that. And 2 issues to call your attention to perhaps on workers' rights. The first is around living wages. Should we move beyond respect for living wages to actual payment of living wages, starting perhaps with direct employees? Very strong arguments pro and con for that, and some complexity of implementation that needs to be worked through. And second, also controversial, should we introduce clearer maximum working hours that include overtime? So at the moment in version 3, there is no actual maximum number of working hours. Should that become part of the standard, perhaps with exceptions for certain contexts? That's just a very quick overview. If anything here has piqued your interest or you think, oh, of course I have an opinion on this issue, please do give us your opinion and your thoughts to guide these decisions. Right, we are moving right along. I'm going to turn it over to Chris for a few minutes on the chain of custody. So Chris, back to you.
Thanks, Chelsea. So yeah, version 3 of the chain of custody, it forms part of the standard revision process. Lots has been learned in the implementation of version 2, but also lots of discussions by the claims and COC working group leading up to this public consultation, really looking at what COC is for and how the underlying models of chain of custody that enable to do what it's there to do, which is to drive uptake of the performance standard upstream and enable efficient flow of information along the value chain. And the result of those processes those discussions has been that we should retain mass balance as the underlying model for chain of custody, ASI's chain of custody standard. That's due to the continuous nature of stream processes, the high degree of mixing through the value chain, and also the shape of bauxite, alumina, aluminium, and scrap markets. So mass balance in this version 3 remains the underlying model for our chain of custody system, which will be, I think, welcome news for those who have spent the last 10 years building systems to enable ASI chain of custody implementation. With that in mind, though, we entered this revision process looking at the standard writ large and how it's been implemented over the last few years. And we saw lots of opportunity. The working group saw lots of opportunity to really streamline the standard. There's lots of duplication in there. There's lots of specificity to types of ASI material. And in the development of version 4 of the performance standard, we could also see some duplication with the performance requirements. And really, performance related requirements sit or should sit in the performance standard. The chain of custody standard is a standard to demonstrate that rules have been enacted in companies to flow ASI material through the value chain in an efficient way, and also a rules-based way. So one of the things that we've done in this version of the standard, you'll see it, is we've really streamlined it. We've stripped out loads and loads of requirements that were there before, which are kind of redundant. They don't really sit in a chain of custody. They really belong in a performance standard. So lots of streamlining of the standard, but the underlying material accounting rules remain the same. And in fact, the requirements themselves are focused on those material accounting elements. One of the things we'd like to hear through the public consultation is whether we have gone too far in streamlining this standard, stripped too much out. So one, look at the materiality, but two, look at whether risk is appropriately managed through implementation of this new version of the standard. A second element which you'll see, and which is articulated in some options in the standard in the paper, is a consultation on an evolution of the mass balance approach. So even as we retain mass balance as the underlying model, we would like to explore, and we'd like to get your feedback on some changes, tweaks to that model in order to drive improved value for our members, but also to maintain or even to enhance ASI's objective of driving uptake of the performance standard. And those three options, I invite you to really delve into the paper to look at those, are one, to retain the existing entity level mass balance approach, status quo, so no change to the entity level mass balance. Option 2 is the same, an entity level mass balance, but with site level minimum sourcing requirements, which would say that any site that is supplying ASI material would have to meet some minimum ASI material sourcing requirements. I'd like to get your feedback on whether that is felt to improve transparency or improve value for you as a consuming company, but also on what that minimum level should be. We've set it at 10%. But it could be any value. Let us know what you think is an appropriate one. We've heard some pre-consultation feedback that 100% is the number to go for. And that looks a bit more like option 3, which is a transition to site level mass balance, where entities would need to have material accounting and balancing of inputs and outputs at the site level. Now that's quite a change to the existing approach, and so built into that option is also a transition period of 5 years. Give us your feedback on that, as Chelsea mentioned, through the survey or through other means to get feedback to us. Also, other options that you might like to see considered for the evolution of that chain of custody standard. So lots going on in chain of custody. Again, use these documents to delve in detail, and please do give us your feedback.
Leah, I think it's over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Chris. So Chelsea and Chris have given a really good run through of what we're consulting on. So I'm going to just summarize kind of how to give your feedback to us. The consultation period will run until April the 20th, 2026. And really your first port of call is the consultation hub, which is a dedicated web page on the ASI website. From here, you'll be able to download all the documents that we've referred to, so the drafts and the supporting resources. The documents are available in multiple languages. So you will find French, German, Chinese, Portuguese. Yeah, first port of call, the consultation hub. And we referred to two ways already of giving feedback. One is the survey, which is online. When you click on the survey, you'll be able to select which areas you want to give feedback on. You can select as many or as few sections and themes as you want. There are no mandatory questions. And there are also free text boxes for you to just give your feedback as you see fit. The second is a feedback form, which is a downloadable Excel. It's different to the mapping tool, which Chris talked about earlier, which I'll get to in a minute. But the feedback form is really designed for you to give very specific feedback related to the criterion and requirements as they are in version 4 of the performance standard or version 3 of the chain of custody standard. So you'll see in there is a space for you to enter the exact reference number that you want to comment on, and you'll be able to enter your feedback into there. And once that's done, you can save it and send it back to us at the email address that's provided there on the slide and also at the website. Failing those two methods, you can just simply email us. We're accepting just your thoughts in an email very simply to that email address. And please do feel free to use that email address if you have any questions or any kind of problems using the tools that we've provided. So yeah, to the tools, Chris has already mentioned, I think it's the next slide, Chelsea, please. Yeah, so on the tools, Chris has already talked about the mapping tool and how you can use it to filter to understand applicability of the requirements against your supply chain activity. You can also use that tool to map the version 4 requirements to the version 3 requirements. So if you're very familiar already with version 3, you can understand how things have evolved into version 4. That is another use of that tool. Yeah, and again, you'll be able to download that tool from the website. The other document that I'd like to just flag here is a slide deck which summarizes the changes in the content of the section. So today we've talked about the structural changes, the materiality and differentiation aspects of how things have changed in the standards. What that document does is actually go into the content and summarizes across all the thematic areas where the changes are and are being proposed. So that's the PS V4 summary of changes. It's a PowerPoint document that's been PDF'd and is there available to download. You'll also find a couple of summary kind of just explainers. There's a one-page document that summarizes everything that we've said today. And there's a short video as well, which some people might find easier to watch than re-watching this webinar, which is also going to be recorded and put up for you. So as we mentioned earlier, this is the second webinar that we've held kind of launching the consultation. Going forward into March, we're going to be doing topic-specific webinars. They're listed here on this slide. They're also on the website, and from the website you'll be able to register. So we'll be doing a spotlight on circularity, on responsible sourcing and chain of custody, and of course on climate. And I think I'll leave it there because we're practically at time, and we did want to take some questions.
Thanks, Leah. So I think we've had only a couple questions come in, but we can answer one or two of those. And if you have one now, please do put it into the Q&A or the chat. So we had one question on, is there any consequence defined if a member wants to be audited against leading practice, but during the audit, they don't make the cut on some leading practices, so it's not clear if they cross the leading practice line? I think this is a good question that needs a little bit more thought and development. But the initial proposal from our side in drafting is that really leading practice is a kind of, you've either ticked the box and demonstrated enough evidence to meet the requirement, or you haven't. So we don't anticipate that you would have a kind of minor nonconformance or major nonconformance on a leading practice. The auditor either makes a decision that you've kind of shown sufficient evidence to be conformant with that requirement, or you haven't. So there could be a scenario where an entity comes very close, they almost meet the 70% with some rounding in practice, but they don't quite meet it. And whether or not we then give them a kind of grace period, a couple of weeks to provide any further evidence, will need some debate. But I think that is a scenario that could potentially happen. Any other questions? Chris or Leah, have you had anyone come through?
There was one previously expressed, which is about the chain of custody. If there are any allocation rule changes, if people have already set up their systems for version 2, what might that mean for version 3? Maybe to flag people that there is we have a chain of custody and responsible sourcing webinar on the 19th of March, 9 o'clock GMT, to deep dive on some of these questions. For all the allocation rules, no, the approach remains from version 2. It's the scope of where it's applied, where those rules apply, that is the focus of those 3 options that I mentioned. Couple of tweaks though, and somewhere to look in this is on the negative or positive balance and the periods over which they are applied. So if you're interested in where those changes are most material, really focus on that material accounting period, overdraw, and negative balances as well. And if you have any questions, get them into us before the next webinar, and we can focus on those on the 19th of March.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a good one to raise. All right. Well, with that, if there are no more questions, then I would say thank you guys very much, everyone who's joined today, for making time, and hopefully that's given you a useful overview. Please do reach out with your feedback or questions as you start to do a deeper look at the documents, and we look forward to hearing from you.